Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into how things spread. Ideas, behaviors, even diseases. We're trying to look past the surface, uncover some of the surprising forces shaping things. We've got some fascinating sources, including a new book that, well, it challenges some old ideas.
Right. And our mission really is to understand these concepts the sources call overstories, tipping points, and superspreaders. These aren't
Right.
just abstract terms. They're sort of the underlying gears, you could say, that create these fevers and contagions all around us, sometimes deliberately, sometimes not. This book revisits ideas about how small things make a big difference, kind of showing how the same tools that could build a better world, well, they can be turned against us too.
Yeah, it's a really fresh take, even from the author, reflecting on his own work from, 25 years ago. He talks about a kind of revenge of the tipping point, looking back and wondering why he wrote certain things, like a whole chapter on Sesame Street. It really sets the scene for how much more maybe complex our view of these contagions has become. So, okay, let's unpack this overstory idea first. So, this concept of an overstory. The author paints this picture like the top layer of a forest, the canopy. It's everywhere but often unseen, and it shapes everything happening below. How does this play out in the real world? What are some solid examples?
Oh, the sources have some pretty wild ones. Take Miami, for example. There's this story about a guy, Philippus Formes. In Chicago, he was known as this, honorable businessman donating millions. Philip of Chicago.
Yeah.
But then he moves to Miami, and his own rabbi said he became Philip of Miami, a ruined individual caught up in an environment where it wasn't just about making money anymore.
And he ends up central to one of the biggest Medicare fraud cases ever, right? That's an incredible shift for one person.
The scale is just staggering. You look at Medicare spending for durable medical equipment in Miami, it was $1,234 per person.
$1,200.
Yeah, compared to maybe $100 on average elsewhere in Florida. And it wasn't just him, it was like the whole culture. The source talks about nominee owners signing checks in these tiny, tiny rooms with steel gates locked from the outside.
All right.
They found fake office fronts in places like the Fontainebleau Hotel, not even trying to look legit. One company chart had the same guy listed as director, administrator, and compliance officer.
That's just brazen, doesn't even cover it. How does an environment get like that? What creates an overstory so powerful it warps a whole city's, moral compass?
Well, the book flates the 1980 theory. See, Miami was pretty sleepy until the 70s, but then in 1980, you had this perfect storm, tons of drug money flooding in, like billions from Latin America. Then the Mariel boat lift brought huge numbers of Cuban refugees, and there was a major race riot. Those three things together created this unique overstory, this sort of culture of lawlessness and, well, flamboyance.
So the environment itself becomes contagious.
Exactly. It's an active force. It shows how it can shift behavior on a huge scale, even for people who seemed honorable before. I mean, even Rick Scott, who became governor, his old healthcare company got caught in a massive fraud case within that same Miami overstory.
So it's not just that Miami attracted certain people, it actually changed them. That immersion is powerful. Are there other examples of communities with these kinds of transformative overstories?
Absolutely. Another really interesting one involves Waldorf schools and vaccine skepticism.
Okay.
You might think, okay, these schools just attract parents who are already anti-vaccine. But the research suggests not really. Parents don't necessarily choose Waldorf because they're looking for an oasis where nobody vaccinates. Instead, it's the Waldorf culture itself, fostering curiosity, self-reliance, this sort of superhero complex where you don't just defer to experts. That becomes the overstory.
I see.
And it changes behavior. The longer a family is part of that community, the fewer vaccines their later kids tend to get. The source calls it a smell, powerful and subtle.
That's fascinating. The environment shaping belief and action. It really highlights the impact, like with S-forms in Miami or the Waldorf parents. And this localized influence, it also shows up in unexpected places, right? Like medicine, something called small area variation.
That's right. Dr. John Wenberg discovered this. He found things like hemorrhoid surgery being 5 times more common in some parts of Vermont than others.
5 times.
For the same condition.
Exactly. Or look at cardiac catheterization for heart attacks. In Boulder, Colorado, doctors used it like 75% of the time. But in Buffalo, New York, only about 23-24%. Huge difference.
That seems unbelievable. How do you explain that? Is it just random?
Not random at all, according to Wenberg. He called them medical clusters. Doctors in one area seem to adopt a shared identity, a common way of doing things, almost like catching the same idea.
Right.
And here's the kicker. When a cardiologist moves, say, from high-use Boulder to low-use Buffalo,
Yeah.
within about a year, they start practicing like the Buffalo doctors.
Wow.
It shows how strong these community stories, these overstories really are. They shape everything, even how medicine gets practiced.
Okay, so if these overstories are so powerful, influencing fraud, vaccines, even surgery rates,
Yeah.
can you deliberately engineer them? Can you manipulate group dynamics, the proportions, to get certain outcomes?
Well, yeah, people definitely try. The sociologist Rosabeth Moss Cantor did work on this, on skewed proportions in groups. She looked at tokenism. When you're just one or two of a minority, say, women on a corporate board, you end up being seen as a symbol for your whole group, not just yourself.
Right, you carry that weight. It's not true integration.
Exactly. It's this really difficult dynamic.
So is this where that magic third idea comes in? Needing more than just a token few?
Precisely. The theory is that something really shifts dramatically when a minority group hits somewhere between, say, a quarter and a third of the total population. Think about white flight back in the 50s and 60s. In cities like Detroit or Atlanta, neighborhoods often tipped from white to black once the black population reached a certain percentage.
Okay.
Or flip it around, corporate boards. That woman effect, women being perhaps more likely to ask tough questions, listen differently, that often doesn't really kick in until you have 3 or more women there, the magic third.
So it's not a smooth, gradual change. It hits a point and then boom.
Yeah, it's often sudden, nonlinear. Small changes can build up and then have these delayed explosive effects.
That nonlinear thing is key. Like Ursula Burns at Xerox, the first black woman CEO of Fortune 500. The source mentions her feeling like the only one of her kind. How does that fit?
It fits perfectly. Being the only one means you're constantly representing. But now, look at the number of South Asian CEOs leading huge companies, IBM, Microsoft, Google. The source calls it a flood. Something definitely tipped. Like, the Wall Street Journal did a profile on the Starbucks CEO, Laxman Narasimhan, and didn't even mention he was Indian.
Because it's become normalized?
Exactly. That's the magic third or maybe magic quarter, changing the whole overstory around leadership.
Is there research that pins down that number more precisely, that threshold for change?
There is. Damon Centola did this really neat experiment, the name game. He found that if just 25% of a group consistently used a new name for something, the entire group would suddenly switch to the new name.
25%. The magic quarter.
Right. And the weird part was, nothing happens until you hit 25%. Then suddenly everything changes. Just one more person pushing it over the edge could make the consensus jump from 0 change to 90% conversion.
Okay, so if you know this, what does it mean for institutions trying to manage diversity, especially competitive places like, say, elite universities? This knowledge seems like it could be used strategically.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where the sources get really interesting, digging into Harvard's admissions. Specifically, this category they call ALDC.
ALDC.
Yeah, it stands for athletes, legacies, deans, or directors list kids, and children of faculty or staff. This group, the book points out, makes up a huge chunk, like 30% of the student body.
30%. Wow.
And it seems to be key to how they manage proportions. You look at a place like Caltech, much more purely meritocratic maybe, and their percentage of Asian students bounces around year to year based on who applies. But at Harvard, that proportion stays remarkably stable.
That is strange, given the fluctuations you'd expect. What's the theory behind why it's so stable? What's the unspoken mechanism?
Well, the book suggests looking at Harvard's massive varsity sports program. They have more Division I teams than any other university. Things like women's rugby, 33 players, women's heavyweight rowing, 40 rowers, lightweight rowing, another 20.
These aren't exactly sports accessible to everyone, socioeconomically speaking.
Right. Becoming a top junior tennis player, for instance. The book mentions costs hundreds of thousands in coaching, travel, everything. There were those scandals with parents paying huge bribes, remember, $180,000 for tennis spots.
So the argument is, this athletic recruitment acts as a way to manage the overall demographic makeup, bringing in privileged kids, maybe with slightly lower academic stats, through sports, kind of an affirmative action for the wealthy.
That's the implication the source material explores. And it highlights the irony. This kind of affirmative action for the privileged goes largely unquestioned. The Supreme Court really struggled with the critical mass argument for racial diversity in the Abigail Fisher case, eventually ruling against race-based affirmative action. But when asked what critical mass actually meant numerically for minorities, they sort of shrugged. Yet the advantage for wealthy athletes seems accepted without much fuss. It shows how carefully these proportions can be managed, even if it's not explicitly stated.
It really underscores how these mechanisms work beneath the surface. Which brings us to maybe an uncomfortable point about how contagion spread. It's not even, is it? They're these super spreaders.
Yeah, that's a really crucial and kind of uncomfortable reality. It's deeply asymmetrical. A very small number often do most of the work in spreading something. Think about air pollution. Donald Stedman's research on car emissions was eye-opening.
What did he find?
He found that just 1% of cars on the road, the real clunkers, the gross polluters, were responsible for 50% of the pollution.
1% causes half the problem.
Exactly. Incredible asymmetry.
Does that same principle hold true for diseases,
Mm-hmm.
for biological contagions?
Very much so. Though the way it works can be surprising. Remember the Biogen COVID outbreak early on, February 2020?
Vaguely, yeah. In Boston?
That's the one. A leadership meeting at the Marriott Hotel, about 175 employees from all over the world. One single person, Mr. Index, brought the virus in, and that one meeting is estimated to have led to over 300,000 infections globally.
300,000 from one person at one event. That's mind-boggling. How? What made that person or that situation so potent?
Well, it confused a lot of public health folks at the time. They were focused on droplets from coughs, sneezes, direct contact. But aerosol scientists, like William Rissenpart mentioned in the source, weren't that surprised.
Why not? What do they know?
They knew the power of aerosols produced just by talking and breathing. When you speak, your vocal cords vibrate and create tiny fluid bubbles aerosols. These are much smaller than droplets from a cough. They can stay airborne for like an hour and carry way more virus particles over time than a single cough or sneeze might.
So just talking normally can make someone a super spreader. Do they produce a lot of these aerosols?
Exactly. And some people naturally produce more than others. Physiology plays a big role. Things like dehydration, having drier airways, can cause fluid to break up into smaller, more concentrated particles when you exhale or talk.
Huh. Interesting.
Also, age and BMI seem to be factors. Older people with higher BMIs tend to be a bit more dehydrated, maybe breathe differently, and they often emit more aerosols. There was an early hint of this back in the 70s with a measles outbreak in Rochester. A second-grade girl infected kids across 14 classrooms. Turns out she was exhaling 10 times more measles particles than usual. A super spreader, before we really had the term.
It's powerful information knowing about super spreaders, but it also feels tricky, doesn't it? Identifying individuals like that, what are the implications?
It is tricky. There's definitely concern about stigma, about blaming individuals. Some argue we shouldn't even focus on it. But as the book kind of argues, nature doesn't really care about political convenience. Understanding the asymmetry is probably vital for control, and this idea connects directly to another concept: monocultures.
Monocultures, like in farming, where planting only one crop makes it vulnerable. How does that apply to people?
It's a really strong parallel. A lack of diversity, whether genetic or cultural, means a lack of resilience. The source uses the example of a town called Poplar Grove. Sounds idyllic, right? Affluent, tight-knit, a real family town. But it also had this extreme ethic of achievement.
Okay, high pressure.
Exactly. And their high school, while top-ranked, accidentally created a social monoculture. There wasn't much crowd diversity. The source puts it starkly. If you're a skater, you have to be a high-achieving skater.
So everyone had to fit this one mold of success.
Pretty much. And that uniformity, while maybe good for school rankings, meant there was very little resilience when things went wrong.
And things did go tragically wrong there, didn't they? With suicides.
Devastatingly so, yes. Poplar Grove had a suicide cluster, an epidemic. When some high-status kids, the ones who really embodied that achievement ethic, died by suicide, it somehow normalized the act within that specific uniform culture. There weren't really alternative paths or identities, no cultural antibodies you might find in a more diverse place. The achievement overstory became kind of suffocating.
That's a really chilling example. It makes me think of the cheetahs. The biological parallel.
Yes, it's a perfect biological analogy. Cheetahs are incredibly genetically uniform. You can apparently graft skin from one cheetah to any other like they're identical twins.
Wow.
Because they went through a near-extinction event about 12,000 years ago. Maybe only a handful survived. So very little genetic diversity. And this caused big problems like difficulty breeding, the solution, bringing in fresh blood. They introduced genetic material from Texas cougars.
Seriously,
Oh,
cougars?
yes. Yeah. And the offspring became outrageously fertile. There was one male dubbed Don Juan. It shows how diversity, genetic or cultural, is key to resilience, to buffering against these kinds of epidemic cascades.
That's a powerful point. Diversity builds strength. So let's loop this back to the overstory idea. Can a whole cultural narrative, a zeitgeist, be consciously changed or rewritten?
Absolutely, and sometimes it happens quite deliberately, though maybe the effects aren't immediate. Look at how we remember the Holocaust. It's got this sort of strained rhythm. The first major U.S. Holocaust museum wasn't until 1961. Most popped up in the 1990s, like half a century after the war.
That seems like a long delay.
It was. Survivors often felt shame, fear. One quote is powerful. Didn't talk about the Holocaust, not even to my own child. Public awareness, even within the Jewish community initially, wasn't what you might think. But then look at a chart of the word Holocaust appearing in books and articles. Around 1978, it just shoots almost straight up.
1978 again. What happened then to trigger that kind of shift in public memory and conversation?
A TV miniseries. NBC aired Holocaust. Two executives, Paul Klein and Erwin Siegelstein, apparently just saw a book proposal and said, why don't we do it?
Just like that.
Seems like it. It ran over 4 nights in April 78. 120 million Americans watched some part of it in nearly half the country. When it aired in West Germany a year later, 15 million people watched, a quarter of their population.
Huge audiences.
Huge. And it was unflinching. There was a scene of soldiers shooting people and then casually looting the bodies. It shattered denial, challenged disbelief. The impact was so strong, the West German parliament actually reversed an earlier decision and got rid of the statute of limitations for Nazi war criminals.
Wow. A TV show literally changed the law and reshaped memory.
Mm.
That's deliberate social engineering on a massive scale.
It really was.
Are there more recent examples? Maybe something like the acceptance of gay marriage? That seemed to shift incredibly fast.
Definitely. If you look back at the early 2000s, activists were pretty gloomy. They were predicting like 20, maybe 40 years before marriage equality would happen. But then public opinion just flipped incredibly quickly. One observer called it the most significant shift in my lifetime.
So what caused that rapid tipping point? Legal cases? Protests?
Those all played a part, for sure. But the source makes a really compelling case that a sitcom, Will and Grace, was a huge factor in changing the cultural overstory.
Will and Grace, really? A sitcom? How?
Well, think about how gay characters were usually portrayed on TV before then. There were these unspoken rules, right? They were never the main focus. Their sexuality was always presented as their defining problem, and they were often shown kind of isolated.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
Will and Grace just broke all those rules.
Yeah.
Will and Jack were central characters. They were funny, successful, had friends, family. Their sexuality was part of them, but not the only part, not the constant source of drama. They were just normal neighbors and friends.
It normalized it for a huge audience.
Exactly. It made gay people relatable, part of the everyday fabric for millions who might not have known many gay people personally. Even Rick Santorum, a very conservative senator, admitted it. He said something like, popular culture shapes those issues. A television show came on the air called Will and Grace. It shows how culture can sometimes lead policy and polls. It just tipped.
That's a fantastic example of cultural shift.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we pull all these threads together, overstories, tipping points, superspreaders, monocultures, how do they help us understand something huge and complex like the opioid crisis?
I think they provide a really powerful lens for it.
And the scale of the opioid crisis, it's starkly American, isn't it? It's not the same kind of problem globally.
Not at all. Jessica Ho's research, cited in the sources, makes that clear. It's fundamentally an American problem. That's a huge, large area of variation. But then you zoom in and you see a small area of variation within the U.S. too. And a lot of that goes back to figures like Paul E. Madden.
Paulie Madden.
Who was he? He was this very zealous anti-drug guy back in California in the 1930s, but his real focus wasn't street drugs, it was painkillers prescribed by doctors. He pushed hard for California's 1939 triplicate prescription law.
Triplicate, meaning 3 copies.
Yeah. For certain opioids, doctors had to use these special pads with 3 carbon copies, one for their records, one for the pharmacy, and one got mailed straight to Madden's state agency. Didn't ban anything, but it created this bureaucratic hurdle, this slight chilling effect, an overstory, basically, that made doctors just pause and think twice before writing that script.
Just that little bit of friction.
Yeah.
Did it make a difference?
A huge difference. If you look at the data decades later, states that had adopted triplicate laws like California, New York, Illinois, had way lower opioid prescription rates. In 2006, California was at about 450 doses per capita. Delaware, without a triplicate law, over 880. It created these clear pockets, this small area variation driven by policy.
Okay, so you have these state-by-state differences baked in,
Yeah.
and then Purdue Pharma comes along with OxyContin.
Exactly. Purdue saw this landscape. They knew where the prescribing was easier, less scrutinized, and they got advice, apparently from McKinsey, the consulting firm, to focus their sales efforts not just broadly, but on the highest volume prescribers, the core and supercore doctors.
This superspreaders.
The superspreader doctors. There's data from 2013 showing just 358 doctors, the top 0.1%, wrote an average of nearly 250 OxyContin prescriptions each in just 6 months. Meanwhile, almost 100,000 doctors at the bottom wrote only one prescription each in that time.
Wow, that's extreme asymmetry again.
It really is. These few doctors were, as the source puts it, maybe not wired like most doctors. They bought the minimized risk arguments, seemed indifferent to the potential for abuse. And Purdue targeted them relentlessly, especially in those non-triplicate states like West Virginia, Tennessee, Nevada. Sales calls there went up fivefold between 2007 and 2016. It was a deliberate strategy exploiting both the regulatory variation and the superspreader phenomenon.
That paints a chilling picture of how these dynamics can be manipulated. Then came what the book calls this truly impossible choice around 2010. What was that?
It's a really tough part of the story. In 2010, Purdue reformulated OxyContin to make it harder to crush or dissolve, trying to curb abuse of the prescription pill.
Okay, that sounds like a responsible step.
On the surface, yes, but it had this awful paradoxical consequence. People addicted to OxyContin who could no longer easily abuse the pills didn't just stop using opioids, they switched. They switched to cheaper, much more dangerous street drugs like heroin and increasingly fentanyl.
No.
Yeah, the data is brutal. After 2010, deaths from prescription opioids kind of leveled off, but deaths from heroin and synthetic opioids like fentanyl just skyrocketed.
So the policy aimed at reducing prescription abuse actually pushed people towards far deadlier alternatives.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly difficult outcome.
It's a nightmare scenario for public health. The book even floats the incredibly difficult idea that maybe the right policy, counterintuitively, might have been to not reformulate OxyContin, to allow the abuse of the relatively safer prescription drug to continue, to prevent the switch to fentanyl and the subsequent explosion in deaths.
Could anyone actually make that argument publicly, allowing prescription abuse?
Imagine trying. It just shows the unbelievable complexity. You try to intervene to socially engineer a better outcome, and you can trigger these unforeseen, devastating cascades. The trade-offs are just agonizing.
This whole deep dive, it really drives home that these epidemics, social, cultural, biological, they aren't random chaos. They have rules. They have boundaries. They're shaped by these overstories, often ones we create ourselves. They shift at tipping points we can sometimes identify. And they're often driven disproportionately by superspreaders, who can also, potentially, be identified.
Right. The knowledge is there, the tools to understand, maybe even control these contagions are, as the source says, sitting on the table right in front of us.
Which leaves us all with a pretty challenging thought, doesn't it? We can see these tools being used sometimes unscrupulously. Or we can try to understand them better ourselves, pick them up, and maybe use them consciously to build a better world. How could you, listening now, spot the overstories, the tipping points, the superspreaders in your own world? Something to think about. Until next time.